All right, another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. This is something I've been excited about and trying to do it for a little while, but she is very busy. So it's great to get her on the podcast, Dr. Colleen Darnell, otherwise known as the Vintage Egyptologist. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So you are known for two things, one of which is vintage fashion, which I know nothing about, and I'm not going to talk about that at all. All of my shirts have holes in them and are bleach stained, so I know nothing about fashion. But the other thing you're known for, obviously, is Egyptology and being an Egyptologist, an author. You've done podcasts. You've got a very cool Instagram page. All right, you got your PhD in 2005, and you've written several books. The most recent, I just had it here a second ago, Egypt's Golden Couple, and I'm going to get the pronunciation horrendously wrong, When Akhenaten and Nefertiti Were Gods on Earth.
And that's actually perfect.
Oh, perfect. I was worried I was going to get I was worried I was going to end up getting the pronunciation messed up. The reason I'm having you on this podcast all about Freemasonry, Freemasons, I was at the Field Museum in Chicago, and Freemasons actually got a shout out in the Egyptology section of the Field Museum, which I put up on my Instagram, right? It mentioned, Freemasons drew their symbology from ancient Egyptian lore. Anybody who is a Freemason knows we do like to reference ancient Egypt, and a lot of that has to do with, I think, Freemasonry is part of the culture, and ancient Egyptian lore really has permeated the culture. Even, the founding of Freemasonry is kind of dated to 1717. Even at that time, right, there was a lot of interest in ancient Egypt, the pyramids, Egyptian mythology. As somebody who, your professional life is in this area, what is it about Egyptian mythology and Egyptian lore that you think has kind of managed to not only captivate people today, but it's captivated people for hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of years, right? Why has it been so long lasting and so captivating for so many people?
That's really a fascinating question, and one that I have spent over a decade trying to answer. In 2013, I curated an exhibit at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. The exhibit was entitled Echoes of Egypt, Conjuring the Land of the Pharaohs. And I tried through different objects and stories to explain why ancient Egypt has fascinated people, as you said, for thousands of years. And it has grown even more intense in the past few hundred. And with the 19th century, the initial decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb 100 years later, that has simply fueled yet more interest in ancient Egypt. And I think the reasons why Egypt remains so fascinating differs from culture to culture. So we see Egyptomania, Egyptian revival in Europe and North America, but we also see it in the Arab Islamic world. There's a man named Ibn Wahshiyya who lived to either side, probably a little bit earlier than 1000 CE, and he was studying scripts all over the world, at least the world that he knew, and he attempted to translate hieroglyphs. And at the time, because there was no Rosetta Stone, there was no bilingual inscription to use as a test for the accuracy of decipherment, that ended up being a dead end in terms of the study of hieroglyphs. But what I think is the driving factor is twofold. One is simply the impressiveness of ancient Egyptian monuments, the scale of the pyramids, the amount of temples and tombs with brilliant colored paint still surviving. All of that just fuels the imagination, and always has and continues to. Even for me as an Egyptologist today, I see these monuments and it inspires awe. And then I think the other side of the equation is the interest that there's been in the hieroglyphic writing system. This is true all the way back in Greece and Rome, where Herodotus and other authors were looking at the hieroglyphic writing system and trying to figure out how it worked. And when hieroglyphs were essentially lost in the late 4th century CE, the last datable hieroglyphic inscription is actually August 394. So we're getting close to an anniversary of that. And that was actually written by a Nubian priest at the island of Philae. And hieroglyphs were essentially forgotten because when the population of the Nile Valley converted to Christianity and the temples were closed, that was where hieroglyphs were taught. And so that entire education system ends, meaning that the hieroglyphs are no longer being used, or the cursive versions, hieratic and demotic. And at the same time, the Egyptian language is written in an alphabetic script in Coptic, because they don't change their language, they change their writing system. And the fact that there are these symbols, or what look like symbols, most of them are actually phonetic, covering just wall after wall after wall, I think that mystery, wanting to know what it says and believing that there is secret knowledge contained within those texts, which there is, although often in a very different way than people have assumed for the past few hundred years. I think those two things together has made Egyptian fascination with ancient Egypt so much a part of cultures all around the world.
And when you talk about kind of the amazing structures that they built, and the awe that inspires, one thing I have always found fascinating is, combining these amazing structures with the antiquity. I mean, I remember reading somewhere that ancient Egypt was fascinating to ancient Egyptians, because if you look at, say, Cleopatra, maybe the most famous Egyptian, I might think she was closer to us than to those initial pyramids. And as a Mason, you look at the oldest stone building, still standing stone building, right? The pyramid of, and again, I'm going to get the pronunciation messed up, Djoser, Djoser.
Yes,
I mean, Djoser. There we go. Perfect. I'm getting the pronunciations all right today. I think that antiquity and the idea that, this civilization could be building these stone structures, so far back in antiquity that even Julius Caesar, or Cleopatra, or Mark Antony would be amazed by them, right? I think that adds so much of a fascination to it as well. And, for yourself, when you're looking back, 4,000 or 5,000 years at this civilization, what's that like for you as an Egyptologist? And do you, I know you've been doing this for a long time in your professional career, but do you still find that level of awe and amazement at both what they were able to accomplish and how long ago they were accomplishing it?
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't matter how many times you go, especially to Sakara, to the Step Pyramid complex, because so much of the original desert environment is still there. Whereas the Giza pyramids are very much a part of modern day Cairo because of the expansion of the city. So when you're at Sakara, you get a sense of what it really was like 4,650 years ago. And it's undeniably awe-inspiring. And one of my favorite aspects of the Step Pyramid complex, and I teach this a lot in my Egyptology classes, is that New Kingdom scribes, there's one, for example, during the reign of Ramses II. So we'll round that off to 1250 BCE. So at this point, the pyramid of Djoser that this Ramessid scribe was visiting was already 1,400 years old. And he wrote the date of his current time and that he visited the pyramid complex of Djoser and how he found it like myrrh in heaven. So all of these different compliments, these ideas of praise and awe struck visitors. And this is happening over 3,000 years ago. And that to me is one of the most remarkable and fascinating aspects of studying ancient Egypt, that you can study the ancient Egyptians themselves studying their own history. And also in 2013, I published a book with Oxford University Press called Imagining the Past, Historical Fiction in New Kingdom Egypt. And I did new editions of 4 works, fictional stories of the New Kingdom, and they can be identified as a unified genre of historical fiction because they're set 200 or even 300 years before they were written. So we think in the modern world of enjoying history through historical fiction, and the ancient Egyptians themselves were writing historical fiction.
Yeah, and I think that's just so fascinating, right? It gives you, I think it gives, at least it gives me a better understanding of just how ancient Egypt really was. One thing that we're kind of, one of the ideas in Freemasonry, when we talk about the original stonemasons, we tend to be talking about ancient Egypt, although it was a different type of stonemason then, and then different types of even Freemasonry now, which is a different animal. But what was it about was it something unique about the environment of Egypt and the Nile that maybe encouraged kind of having these buildings of stone and using stone to build for what seems like, from what I understand, kind of the first time in history to actually be creating these great stone structures and pyramids. What was it about, or is there something specific or special about the area or the culture that kind of encouraged really what strikes me as a giant leap in terms of technology and building and all of the math and geometry you need to be able to build these great structures?
Mm-hmm. Along the Nile Valley, you have tremendous reserves, tremendous stone resources. So limestone in the north, sandstone in the south, in addition to granite around the region of Aswan. So the fact that the Nile Valley is surrounded by these deserts full of building stones essentially means that they have the raw materials for monumental stone constructions, which is not true everywhere in the world. It is in some places, but not in others. So if you look at ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the main building material is mud brick because that was the resource that was commonly available. And then you can combine the availability of raw materials with the surplus agriculture, the surplus food created by the annual flood of the Nile that deposited a layer of rich black silt that was replenished every year. And it allowed for very intensive farming without much input of additional resources. So Egypt was a place where a surplus was much easier to create than, again, a lot of other environments around the world. And with the invention of writing about 3250 BCE and the formation of a centralized bureaucracy, the ancient Egyptians were also able to have the manpower resources because the construction of the pyramids was predominantly financed through tax labor, what we call corvée. So you owed taxes to the state, and one of the ways that you could often fulfill that tax duty was working on state-sponsored projects, including the pyramids. And when the fields were flooded, and this is where you have this perfect synergy of environment and culture, when the fields were flooded and farmers essentially didn't have anything they could do because their fields were underwater, they could work for the state. And that is also the time when it was the easiest to bring the stones from the quarries and float them over to the pyramids. And we even have a papyrus journal. This was only found in the past 10, 15 years, of a man named Merer, who was responsible for a boat that transported some of the final stones that went into the Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. So Egypt really is a special place because of the natural resources, the environment, especially the flooding of the Nile, which happened up until the 1960s with the building of the Aswan High Dam, and this civilizational structure with writing and a bureaucracy.
There's the building of the structure, the pyramid, whatever it may be. But then another thing I'm fascinated by, and this does play into Freemasonry, but I think it just so many different facets of life. You know, after the structure is built, then the idea of kind of imparting sacredness, if you want to use that word, into the structure, right? And even in modern days, right? Like, this is a place where you can wear your hat. This is a place where you can't wear your hat. Like, this idea of what is and isn't a sacred place for people. And in Freemasonry, we have, you know, a Masonic temple, and we have the lodge room, which is kind of the more sacred space versus outside of it. And it seems to me, based on my very limited amateur's research, that this idea of, okay, this place is sacred, this building is more than just the stones that we used to build it, but is actually an important sacred location, that seems to have really started with ancient Egypt and with some of these pyramids, and this idea of separating out a sacred space from a non-sacred space. Does that, to just from your studies and research, where do you see this idea of sacredness really kind of taking hold in terms of man-built spaces? Because I'm sure before there was such places, right, in nature, you might have different religious leaders and priests and saying, you know, this part of the woods is sacred, this part isn't. But the idea of then man-made spaces becoming sacred and becoming something more than just the stones that they're built, where do you see that first coming from in ancient Egypt, and what are some of the causes of that, you think?
The earliest evidence we have of the creation of sacred space in ancient Egypt goes back to the pre-dynastic era. And by 3500 BCE, and likely even before, we see this separation of man-made spaces that seem to be early ritual centers, probably temples, if we're going to show continuity with later ancient Egyptian monuments, but also the idea of rock inscriptions, for example, in the desert along ancient roads. That those inscriptions, this is something that my husband, Professor John Darnell at Yale University, has studied in depth, that the carving of inscriptions in the desert, particularly of boats and animals, and the juxtaposition of animals that express early ancient Egyptian beliefs, because again, we can trace that later, and certainly with boats being carriers of the divine, that even in an outside space, you could create a place, and likely a sacred space, within that desert landscape. And so we have this combination of the desert itself can be sacred, or areas of the desert, and the desert is the place whence these stone materials for the construction of temples come. So quarries for the ancient Egyptians were sacred. They can be the location of chapels and shrines, so essentially miniature temples, and the idea that the stones that are used to construct the temple are already sacred. We see this especially with obelisks and statues, where stele from the reign of Seti I and Ramses II describe the king himself going to a quarry and identifying an obelisk in the quarry. The obelisk hasn't been carved yet, but that sacred form is already present within the stone. And that is truly remarkable, the complexity of thought around materials. I think is something that we don't often associate with ancient Egypt because of the awe-inspiring pyramids and this idea of, well, it must have implications for how tyrannical pharaohs were or aspects of that. But instead, if we look at least what the ancient Egyptians believed they were doing, we see this deep connection between sacredness, construction, and the materials themselves.
And do you think that, or to what extent do you think the imparting of sacredness or a sacred character onto these different elements, whether it be the quarries, the stones themselves, or the building, to what extent do you think that helped with the actual building process? Did it kind of encourage? Did it encourage the building of it? Encourage the builders, whether it be slaves or the architects themselves, to treat the building with more reverence, or materials with more reverence? Do you think that there was a benefit to this idea of sacredness in the construction process and in the preservation of these structures?
Absolutely. The people who, again, were working, if not for wages, then to essentially pay off an annual tax debt. So many of the people who were working on the pyramids would have been hauling stones and performing, rather basic tasks that simply required manpower. But much of the construction would have been people who were specifically trained in stone construction techniques, the scribes that even calculated all the bread and beer that was needed. And we have, as Dr. Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner have discovered at Giza, the necropolis of the pyramid builders. So we even can put names and faces to these constructions. And absolutely, everyone involved in that project would have understood the sacred nature of their ultimate goal of constructing the pyramid. Or this is certainly true in the New Kingdom with temples, or even a more specialized community, the workers who lived at a site we now call Jarl Medina, who were responsible for the construction. I apologize, the whining is our Basenji puppy, Selket, who's a little frustrated at the moment. So it's an ancient Egyptian breed, though, so fully in keeping with the podcast topic. So at this community at Deir Medina, the men who were excavating and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings would have definitely understood how significant that entire process was in terms of religion and theology, that they really were creating the final horizon, the model of the duat of the netherworld for the king. And the king being the link between heaven and earth, this semi-divine office that enabled a mediation between the realm of the divine and the human. I absolutely believe that the construction of ancient Egyptian monuments and the successful completion and preservation of those monuments throughout ancient Egyptian history did have a lot to do with the belief in how sacred those monuments were. Now, not everyone, I'm sure, believed that to the same degree, but at least that's the way that the ancient Egyptians envisaged it working.
I mean, well, it's amazing how you used a very important Freemason word, the R word, ritual, before, right? And it's amazing how when people ask me, about Freemasonry or like, what it is, it's a fraternity, right? And people ask about the rituals. The purpose of the rituals, in my mind, anyways, and people have different interpretations, right? Is you create bonds through shared experiences, which seems to me the purpose of any ritual. If we've all been through the same thing, we have a bond. And it seems like in ancient Egypt, or with these builders and constructors, a lot of these rituals and sacredness, it's the same thing. It's a way to bond through another shared experience and another shared understanding kind of the world. It seems like that is something that was very important to ancient Egypt, especially life was a lot more difficult back then for a lot more people, right? And you need a way to bond with each other, and these rituals and this common understanding seems like a really good way to do that, while you're also struggling to build these massive and awe-inspiring structures.
Mm-hmm. And we see from the construction of the pyramids all the way through to Deir el-Medina, the idea that the construction work was done in cohesive groups. And those groups in the reign of Khufu, there's one group that are actually called the drunk men of Khufu, because one of the things you did during the course of, say, the New Year's ritual was consume massive amounts of alcohol. So, and they actually, these work crews during the time of Khufu give themselves names, and they wrote those names on some of the stones that made it into the Great Pyramid. And I think that this cohesiveness of the men working together towards a definite product, towards a definite goal. And in Deir el-Medina, there was the left side and the right side. And it seemed to have also related even to the arrangement of where people lived in the community, and certainly family relations, and the different all the different families at Deir el-Medina. We see a lot of intermarriages, and it's fascinating to see that community evolve over time. And we have so many written sources that we can really say who these people were and how their jobs changed over time, from being an apprentice to being a scribe to being, perhaps in charge of the work crew itself. And all of this relates to a identity as a group with specific skills working on a project. And I think there certainly was a ritual aspect of that, because we know that, for example, Deir el-Medina, the temple there and the worship of ancestors, all of this relates to the creation of a community.
So I know that you have to run in a second. So I'll leave you with the last question, not to end on a controversial note, but I am really curious. I saw your interview, or not interview, I guess your reaction to one of my favorite movies, The Mummy, with Brendan Fraser. And it got me curious, because this is kind of a weirdly controversial topic in Freemasonry. I was wondering about your opinion as an Egyptologist. The depiction of ancient Egypt or Egyptology in cinema and in movies, because I've, my podcast, done a few reactions to depictions of Freemasonry in media, and there's always debate back and forth. And I was curious what your thoughts are from your profession, because obviously I'm just guessing. I don't know. I could be wrong, but my assumption is The Mummy is not the most historically or most accurate depiction of your profession that there is. I don't know if you're out there fighting mummies that come back to life, but what's your thought on, kind of your of ancient Egypt or Egyptology kind of being portrayed in media? Do you think it's ultimately of benefit to your profession, or do you worry about kind of it being portrayed in a way that misinterprets what it is? Just what are your thoughts on that? Because that's always a debate that we have in Freemasonry, and I'm guessing in almost everywhere, which is, how much do we do we want the media and stuff and the media attention? What if they get things wrong? That type of thing.
It's a really complex question, because even just looking at I haven't seen the most recent Indiana Jones movie yet, but the interest that that franchise sparked in archaeology, I think there have been definite benefits to that. And even the Mummy movie, there's a lot of interest again that is sparked in Egyptology. And again, I apologize. Selket the messenger is a little frustrated because she wants to go. And where I think it crosses into being an issue and truly into negative territory is movies about aliens or aliens building the pyramids. And when you get to aspects of the study of the past that are demonstrably false and quite insulting to anyone in the field, and in Egypt, that's where I would draw the line. So fictional, fun, set in the past, I think can be a benefit, especially when it drives interested people to research more and to find out more real information.
Perfect. And with that, I'll let you go because I know you got to run. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast, and thank you for all the work that you do. I know I love ancient history, and it's been great to see your Instagram page or YouTube, really encouraging others to learn about this as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.